At first glance, the photograph looks like a practical joke. 5 American Marines, filthy and exhausted, are casually pedaling captured Japanese bicycles down the main street of a burning city. They aren't taking cover. They aren't firing their weapons. They look like tourists on a joyride through hell. But the year is 1944. The city is Garapan on the island of Saipan, and this is no joke. These 5 men are 3 miles behind enemy lines, completely cut off from the 2nd Marine Division. Surrounding them in the smoking ruins are 29,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, who are waiting for the sun to go down to launch the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Leading this bicycle patrol is First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky, a chain-smoking officer who wasn't supposed to be here. His platoon wasn't made up of model soldiers. They were brawlers, thieves, and brig rats pulled straight from the stockade. The Marine Corps called them a liability. The Japanese would soon call them the 40 Thieves. But to understand why the U.S. military entrusted the most critical reconnaissance mission of the invasion to a squad of supposed criminals, riding stolen bicycles, we have to go back to the disaster that forced the Marines to break their own rules. That disaster was named Tarawa. 7 months before the bicycle patrol on Saipan, the U.S. Marine Corps learned a lesson written in blood on the coral reefs of Betio Island. On the 20th of November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division launched an assault on a strip of sand barely larger than a parking lot, believing it would be a walkover. The admirals had promised that the naval bombardment would obliterate every Japanese fortification, leaving only a few days' survivors to surrender. They were wrong. As the ramp of the first Higgins boat dropped into the surf, the Marines weren't met with surrender. They were met with a wall of steel. The naval shells had smashed the palm trees and churned the sand. But they hadn't touched the Japanese pillboxes buried deep underground, reinforced with concrete and coconut logs. The intelligence maps the Marines carried were almost useless. They showed where the island was, but they failed to show where the enemy was. Aerial reconnaissance, the primary method of intelligence gathering in 1943, had a fatal flaw. A reconnaissance plane flying at 5,000 feet takes a photo of the jungle canopy. To the intelligence officer back on the ship, a cluster of palm fronds looks like nothing more than vegetation. But to the Marine wading through chest-deep water at the seawall, that same cluster of fronds is camouflage for a Type 92 heavy machine gun that is currently cutting his squad to pieces. The blindness was total. The Marines at Tarawa had to discover enemy positions by walking into their line of fire. It was reconnaissance by death. In just 76 hours of fighting, over 1,000 Marines were killed and another 2,000 wounded. The lagoon ran red with blood for days. Watching this catastrophe unfold was Colonel James Riseley, the commander of the 6th Marine Regiment. Riseley was a hard-edged pragmatist who understood the grim mathematics of amphibious warfare. He looked at the casualty reports from Tarawa and realized that the Marine Corps was facing an existential crisis. The next target, Saipan, wasn't a flat sandbar like Tarawa. It was a fortress island of mountains, caves, and ravines, garrisoned by 30,000 fanatics who considered the ground to be sacred Japanese soil. Riseley knew that if his regiment hit the beaches of Saipan with the same blindness they had at Tarawa, the 6th Marines wouldn't just take heavy casualties. They would cease to exist. He needed a solution. But the standard Marine Corps doctrine offered none. The manual said to send out patrols, but a standard Marine rifle squad was designed for violence, not subtlety. A rifle squad is a hammer. It moves in formation, it carries heavy gear that rattles, and its primary method of dealing with an ambush is to achieve fire superiority, to shoot back with everything it has. That works when you are attacking. It is suicide when you are trying to sneak 3 miles behind enemy lines to draw a map. Riseley realized he didn't need more hammers. He needed a scalpel. He needed a unit that could operate in the negative space of the battlefield, the gaps between enemy units. He needed men who could lay motionless in the mud for 12 hours while an enemy patrol walked inches from their heads. He needed men who could memorize a topographical map, infiltrate a Japanese tunnel system, count the artillery shells, and get out without snapping a single twig. This required a psychological profile that the Marine Corps spent boot camp trying to destroy. Boot camp is designed to strip away individuality and replace it with collective obedience. You march in step. You eat when told. You shoot when ordered. But a man alone in the jungle, cut off from radio contact, cannot wait for orders. He has to think. He has to improvise. He has to be willing to break the rules of civilized warfare to survive. Colonel Riseley came to a radical conclusion. The perfect Marine, the one with the creased trousers and the shiny buckle who followed every regulation, was exactly the wrong man for this job. The perfect Marine would freeze without an officer to tell him what to do. To survive the suicide missions, Riseley was planning for Saipan. He needed the imperfect Marine. He needed the outliers. He needed a leader who was just as unconventional as the mission itself. He didn't go to the staff college or the parade grounds to find him. He looked for an officer who treated the rule book as a suggestion rather than a commandment. He found First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky. Ski, as his men called him, was a 9-year-old from Pennsylvania who looked more like a prize fighter than an officer. He was known for his disdain for spit and polish regulations and his obsession with practical lethality. Riseley called Tachovsky into his office and gave him an order that would have terrified a lesser man. "I want you to build a Scout Sniper Platoon," Riseley told him. "I want 40 men. I want you to train them to live off the land, to move like ghosts, and to kill without being seen. And I don't care where you find them." Tachovsky looked at the table of organization and equipment. The Marine Corps didn't have a supply chain for the kind of unit Riseley was describing. They didn't have the specialized weapons, the camouflage, or the selection protocols. But Tachovsky understood the subtext of Riseley's order. He wasn't being asked to follow a manual. He was being asked to write a new one. Most officers would have started their recruitment drive by looking at the marksmanship scores, picking the men who could hit the bullseye on a sunny day at the range. Tachovsky didn't even look at the scores. He knew that hitting a paper target at 500 yards was a mechanical skill anyone could be taught to shoot. But you couldn't teach a man to suppress the instinct to panic when he was alone in the dark. You couldn't teach a man the savage cunning required to hunt another human being. So, Frank Tachovsky turned his back on the barracks and walked straight toward the one place on the base where he knew he would find men who had already proven they could survive a fight. He walked to the brig. The brig at Camp Tarawa was not a place for rehabilitation. It was a holding pen for the Marine Corps' biggest headaches. Located on the big island of Hawaii, the camp served as the refitting ground for the 2nd Marine Division, and its stockade was filled with men who had spent their liberty hours starting brawls in helo bars, distilling moonshine in the jungle, or flattening military police who tried to arrest them. To the brass, these men were discipline cases. To First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky, they were a gold mine. Tachovsky walked past the cells, ignoring the pristine records of the headquarters clerks and the drill instructor's favorites. He was looking for a specific kind of trouble. He didn't want criminals in the predatory sense. He had no use for thieves who stole from their own squad mates or men who hurt the innocent. He was looking for righteous insubordination. In the rigid hierarchy of the 1,944 military, insubordination was usually the result of a clash between a man's survival instinct and a bureaucracy's arbitrary rules. A Marine who punched a superior officer because he was drunk was a liability. But a Marine who punched a superior officer because that officer gave a stupid order that was going to get people killed, that was a man Tachovsky could work with. He began interviewing the prisoners, looking for physical evidence of their history. "Let me see your hands," he would order. He wasn't checking for cleanliness. He was looking for scar tissue on the knuckles. He looked for noses that had been broken and set crooked. He looked for the 1,000-yard stare, not of trauma, but of defiance. His logic was a complete inversion of military doctrine. In a standard infantry engagement, unit cohesion is maintained by the chain of command. The private waits for the corporal waits for the sergeant, and the sergeant waits for the lieutenant. It is a system of dependency designed to move thousands of men like a single machine. But deep reconnaissance is the antithesis of a machine. It is a lonely, terrifying endeavor where the chain of command does not exist. When a scout sniper is 3 days behind enemy lines and spots a Japanese patrol, there is no sergeant to tell him whether to freeze or fire. There is no manual for the million variables of the jungle. In that moment, the good Marine, the one trained to wait for orders, hesitates. And in the unforgiving calculus of the Pacific War, hesitation was a death sentence. Tachovsky knew that the men in the brig didn't hesitate. They acted on impulse. When cornered in a bar fight against 3 sailors, they didn't wait for permission to swing a chair. They assessed the threat and neutralized it immediately. They were natural improvisers who viewed rules not as absolute laws, but as obstacles to be navigated. This trait, which made them terrible garrison soldiers, made them potentially brilliant guerrilla fighters. One by one, Tachovsky made them an offer. It wasn't a pardon, and it wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. It was a challenge. "I'm building a platoon," he told them. "We're going to be the first ones in. We're going to be operating alone, miles away from support. If you get into trouble, there's no cavalry coming to save you. You'll probably get killed. But if you come with me, you get out of this cage, and you get to fight the war on your own terms." The men who stepped forward were a motley collection of society's outliers. There were former boxers, construction workers, farm boys who hunted for food during the Depression, and even a former bodyguard for a Chicago gangster. They were rough, loud, and disrespectful of rank. Among them was Private Bill Knuppel, a man whose ability to navigate chaos would become legendary, and Private Marvin Strombo, who possessed a quiet lethality that terrified anyone who crossed him. Tachovsky took 40 of them. He didn't march them back to the barracks to teach them how to salute or how to polish their boots. He took them into the Hawaiian jungle and taught them how to disappear. The training regimen he devised was brutal and unorthodox. He stripped away the standard Marine issue gear, which he found heavy and noisy. Canteens clanked against belts, helmets reflected light, heavy boots snapped twigs. Tachovsky encouraged his men to modify their kits, wrapping metal buckles in tape and swapping heavy boots for tennis shoes or Japanese tabi socks when silence was paramount. He taught them the art of stalking, moving so slowly that the human eye, which is evolved to detect motion, scans right past you. A good Marine could march 20 miles a day. Tachovsky's men practiced moving 20 yards in an hour, agonizing over every placement of a hand or knee to ensure not a single leaf was disturbed. But the most critical lesson wasn't physical, it was psychological. He had to teach these individual brawlers to fight as a pack. He didn't do it through drill, he did it through shared hardship and a collective sense of superiority. He told them that the rest of the Marine Corps looked down on them, that the spit and polish officers thought they were garbage. He forged an identity of the rejected that was stronger than any unit pride found in a manual. They weren't just Marines anymore. They were Tachovsky's terrors. And because the Marine Corps refused to give them the high-grade equipment Tachovsky believed they needed to survive, they decided that if the quartermaster wouldn't supply it, they would simply take it. This attitude would earn them their most enduring nickname, one that would follow them from the training grounds of Hawaii to the blood-soaked ridges of Saipan. They were about to become the 40 Thieves. And their first heist wasn't against the Japanese, it was against their own side. To call it theft implies they wanted to get rich. To Tachovsky's men, it was aggressive logistical acquisition, and it was driven by a simple, bitter truth. In 1944, the United States Marine Corps was the poor relation of the American military family. While the Army units stationed in Hawaii were flush with brand new Jeeps, endless crates of Lucky Strikes, and the latest radios, the Marines at Camp Tarawa were often scavenging through the leftovers of World War I. But Frank Tachovsky refused to let budget constraints dictate his platoon's survival rate. If the quartermaster couldn't provide the gear necessary to keep his men alive behind enemy lines, Tachovsky decided they would simply go down the road and take it from the army. The raids were conducted with the same military precision they applied to their jungle training. Under the cover of darkness, Tachovsky's men would slip into army depots and navy warehouses, bypassing sentries with the silent movement skills they had been perfecting for weeks. They didn't take money. They took wire cutters, extra canteens, high-quality boots, and crates of liberated K-rations. They even managed to hotwire and repaint an entire Jeep before the Army MPs could file a missing vehicle report. By the time the platoon was fully equipped, they were wearing a hodgepodge of stolen gear that would have given a dress code inspector a heart attack. The rest of the 2nd Marine Division, watching this band of brig rats flaunt their ill-gotten gains, stopped calling them the Scout Sniper Platoon. The name the 40 Thieves was born. It was meant as a pejorative by the officers, but among the enlisted men, it was whispered with a mix of jealousy and respect. But the most controversial piece of equipment in their arsenal wasn't stolen. It was requested by Tachovsky himself, and it sparked a furious debate between the frontline realists and the paper-pusher ordnance officers. Tachovsky demanded that his men be armed with the M1903A1 Springfield rifle. To the modern eye, this choice seems baffling. The standard Marine infantryman carried the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic marvel that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. The Springfield was a bolt-action relic from 1903, requiring the shooter to manually cycle the bolt after every single shot. In a firefight, the Garand offered overwhelming volume of fire. The Springfield offered a slow, methodical cadence that seemed suicidal in close-quarters jungle combat. But Tachovsky wasn't interested in volume. He was interested in surgical precision, and to achieve that, he paired the ancient rifle with a piece of technology that the brass considered absolute heresy: the 8-power unorthodox scope. The unorthodox looked less like a weapon of war and more like a piece of fragile laboratory equipment. It was a telescope, nearly 2 feet long, mounted high above the rifle's receiver on delicate external aluminum rings. It was designed for civilian target shooting competitions, where polite gentlemen fired at paper targets on manicured lawns. The ordnance officers were appalled. They argued that the unorthodox was too fragile for combat. The external adjustment knobs were exposed to the elements. A single grain of sand in the micrometer threads could jam the mechanism. The long tube would snag on every vine in the jungle. The lenses would fog in the humidity. "You are giving these men a glass eye that will break the first time they drop it," one officer argued. "You are sending them out with a toy." Tachovsky ignored them. He understood a principle of jungle warfare that the manual writers had missed. The most dangerous time in the Pacific wasn't high noon. It was the gray hours, dawn and dusk. This was when the Japanese launched their attacks, and this was when human vision failed. The jungle canopy turned twilight into near total darkness, making it impossible to spot a camouflaged enemy with the naked eye or even standard low-power optics. The unorthodox, with its massive objective lens and high magnification, was a light bucket. It gathered the faint ambient light of the jungle and focused it, artificially brightening the image. Through the unorthodox, a sniper could look into a pitch-black shadow at 5 a.m. and see the outline of a Japanese officer's helmet as clearly as if it were noon. Tachovsky handed these fragile toys to his roughnecks, men who had been thrown in the brig for barroom brawling, and taught them to treat the glass like a religious artifact. They learned to wrap the scopes in canvas to protect them from moisture. They learned to carry the rifle cradled in their arms, rather than slung over a shoulder, to prevent the scope from knocking against trees. They spent hours at the range, but not firing at standard silhouettes. Tachovsky had them shooting at helmet-sized targets from 600 yards away. The click-clack of the Springfield bolts became a rhythm of lethal promise. While the rest of the division practiced storming beaches in waves, the 40 Thieves practiced the art of the single, silent shot. By June 1944, the training was over. The Thieves had their stolen boots, their obsolete rifles, and their civilian scopes. They boarded the transport ships for Saipan, leaving behind the safety of Hawaii for an island that intelligence promised was an impenetrable fortress. The officers on the ship looked at the 40 Thieves with their strange long rifles and shook their heads. They were convinced that the delicate glass scopes would shatter within an hour of hitting the beach, leaving Tachovsky's men defenseless. They were wrong. The glass wouldn't break. But the preconceived notions of how a war should be fought were about to be shattered into 1,000 pieces. The Thieves were about to land, and they weren't waiting for the sun to come up. The sun did not save them, because the sun did not stay. As darkness fell over Saipan on the 16th of June, 1944, the humid air thickened with a terrifying anticipation. The 40 Thieves were dug into shallow foxholes hundreds of yards ahead of the main marine line, acting as the regiment's sensory organs in the pitch black. They were isolated, exposed, and waiting for the inevitable. Marine intelligence had warned that the Japanese army owned the night. The imperial doctrine emphasized the yasen, the night attack, where spiritual strength and bayonets were supposed to overcome American firepower. But what was gathering in the jungle beyond the perimeter wasn't a banzai charge of screaming infantry. It was something the Marines had been told didn't exist in force in the Pacific. At 0330 hours, the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, rhythmic thrumming that rattled the teeth of the men lying in the mud. It wasn't the sharp crack of thunder or the boom of artillery. It was the mechanical growl of heavy diesel engines. Then came the metallic squeal of dry tracks grinding against coral rock. The popular myth of this battle often depicts a single ninja tank sneaking down a ravine to assassinate a colonel, stopped by a lone hero with a bazooka. The reality was far more terrifying. The 9th Tank Regiment, the pride of the Japanese Armor Corps, was launching the largest armored assault of the Pacific War. 44 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks and Type 95 light tanks were roaring out of the darkness, carrying infantry on their hulls, intent on driving a wedge of steel straight into the sea. This was a tidal wave of armor, and the first thing it would hit was Frank Tachovsky's platoon. As the silhouette of the lead tank emerged from the jungle, the 40 Thieves faced a mathematical impossibility. A sniper rifle, even one with a high-powered scope, cannot penetrate the 25mm hardened steel armor of a Chiha tank. A bullet would simply shatter against the hull. But Tachovsky had trained his men to look for the machine's eyes, not its armor. Japanese tank doctrine in 1944 had a fatal flaw. The Type 97 tanks had poor internal visibility. To effectively coordinate a night attack, keep formation, and spot targets, the tank commanders had to ride with their hatches open, standing exposed in the turret cupolas to direct their drivers. They believed the darkness protected them. They believed the Americans, blinded by the night, would be spraying machine gun fire wildly at the noise, too inaccurate to hit a man-sized target on a moving vehicle. They didn't know about the unorthodox scopes. Through the fragile 8-power optics that the ordnance officers had mocked, the 40 Thieves saw a very different battlefield. The large objective lenses of the scopes drank in the starlight and the flashes of distant flares, illuminating the jungle in a ghostly monochrome. In the crosshairs, the invisible Japanese commanders standing in their turrets were clearly defined targets. Tachovsky gave the order not to fire at the tanks, but to button them up. The first shot from a Springfield rifle cracked through the humid night. 300 yards away, a Japanese commander slumped over the rim of his turret, dead before he heard the sound. Then another shot rang out, and another. Panic rippled through the Japanese column. Officers who were leaning out to signal turns were suddenly dropping into the crew compartments. The surviving commanders instinctively ducked inside and slammed their heavy steel hatches shut. This was the button-up the moment a tank transforms from a predator into a blind, stumbling beast. Inside a buttoned-up Type 97 at night, the world disappears. The driver is looking through a narrow slit of armored glass that offers a field of view of barely 30 degrees. The commander is blind. The coordination of the entire assault began to disintegrate. Without commanders guiding them from the open hatches, the tanks began to drift. They missed their turn coordinates. They clumped together, blocking each other's lines of fire. Some veered off into ravines. Others drove blindly into soft marshes where they bogged down. The 40 Thieves had effectively blinded the enemy army. Once the tanks were disoriented, the scouts transitioned from precision to brute force. They unleashed their own stolen arsenal, bazookas, and anti-tank grenades, hitting the confused beasts from the flanks. But the scouts were just the speed bump. The noise and the chaos they created acted as the ultimate early warning system for the 6th Marine Regiment behind them. By the time the Japanese armor stumbled into the main Marine lines, they were no longer a coordinated spearhead. They were a disorganized mob of blind vehicles. The waiting Marines, alerted by the firefight ahead, opened up with 37mm anti-tank guns, half-tracks mounting 75mm cannons, and endless bazooka fire. The jungle erupted into a slaughterhouse of burning steel. The Type 97 seconds, their thin armor failing against heavy American weaponry, cooked off one by one. Turrets were blown skyward on pillars of flame. The infantry riding on the decks were cut down by canister shot. When the sun finally rose over Saipan on the morning of June 17th, the field was littered with the smoking hulks of the 9th Tank Regiment. It was the graveyard of the Japanese Armored Corps. General Saito's gamble had failed. He had thrown his iron fist at the Americans, but the fist had been broken before it could land a punch. And out in the negative space, ahead of the lines, the 40 Thieves were still alive. They checked their rifles, wiping the dew from the fragile glass lenses that had just helped dismantle a tank regiment. They had survived the hammer blow. But the battle for Saipan wasn't over. The Japanese retreated not into surrender, but into the ruins of Garapan, a city of concrete skeletons where tanks couldn't go, and where artillery couldn't distinguish a soldier from a shadow. Tachovsky received new orders. The easy part, the open battle, was finished. Now, Colonel Riseley needed to know what was waiting inside the city. He needed a map of the kill zones, but crawling through the rubble on your stomach would take days, and the Marines needed the intel in hours. Tachovsky looked at his exhausted men, then at the city, and then at a strange discovery one of his scouts had made near a captured supply dump. It was the kind of idea that gets men court-martialed or killed. But for the 40 Thieves, it was just another Tuesday. They weren't going to crawl into Garapan, they were going to ride. The ride began where logic ended. Saipan had been the Paris of the Pacific, the administrative capital of the Japanese Mandate. By late June 1944, it was a graveyard of concrete skeletons. American naval bombardment had stripped the facades off the buildings, leaving a twisted maze of rebar, shattered walls, and rubbled streets. This was the most dangerous terrain on Earth for an infantryman, an urban canyon, where a sniper could be hiding in any one of 1,000 broken windows. Colonel Riseley was staring at a map that was blank in the center. He knew the Japanese were massing inside Saipan for a final stand, but he didn't know where. If he sent his battalions in blindly, they would be butchered in the crossfire. He needed the locations of the machine gun nests and the mortar pits. He needed eyes inside the city. But time was the enemy. A traditional scout patrol, crawling on bellies through the debris, would take 24 hours to penetrate the city and return. Riseley didn't have 24 hours. The assault was scheduled for the next morning. Frank Tachovsky looked at the problem, then he looked at a pile of equipment his men had found near a captured supply depot. Leaning against a cratered wall were 5 Japanese military bicycles. They were sturdy, utilitarian machines, painted olive drab, used by Japanese messengers to run orders between command posts. To a standard officer, they were souvenirs. To Tachovsky, they were the key to a radical experiment in psychological camouflage. He understood that the human brain, and specifically the soldier's brain, relies on pattern recognition. If a Japanese sentry sees a silhouette creeping through the shadows, hunched over and trying to hide, his brain instantly registers threat. He fires. But if that same sentry sees a group of men moving casually down the center of the street, riding bicycles in broad daylight, the brain hesitates. It tries to categorize the data. Americans don't ride bicycles. Americans don't move casually in the open. Therefore, these men must be friendly. They must be messengers. It was a gamble on the enemy's confusion. Ski stripped his team down. They left the heavy radios and the packs behind. They slung their Springfield rifles across their backs, barrels down, to look less aggressive. They wore their utility caps low. 5 men, Tachovsky, Strombo, and 3 others mounted the bicycles and pedaled out of the jungle and onto the main road leading into the heart of Saipan. The first 100 yards were the longest of their lives. They pedaled past the burning husks of buildings, their tires crunching over broken glass and spent shell casings. The silence was deafening, broken only by the squeak of a rusted chain. They kept a steady pace, not too fast. Panic, not too slow. Suspicion. They had to look bored. They had to look like they belonged there. Then, they saw them. A squad of Japanese soldiers was digging a defensive position in the ruins of a storefront, stacking sandbags in a window. The Marines tightened their grip on the handlebars, fighting the urge to reach for their weapons. They didn't duck. They didn't swerve. They just kept pedaling. The Japanese soldiers looked up. They saw 5 dusty figures riding past. The silhouette was right. The bicycles were Japanese issue. The behavior was right. Administrative traffic moving between zones. The Japanese soldiers watched them pass, then went back to filling sandbags. The deception was working. Emboldened, the 40 thieves rode deeper into the city. They weren't just surviving, they were mapping. As they coasted down the ruined avenues, they were memorizing the battlefield. Heavy machine gun covering the intersection. Mortar pit in the courtyard of the bank. Anti-tank gun concealed in the lobby of the school. They were building a mental model of the death trap, waiting for the 6th Marines. The surreal nature of the mission peaked near the town square. A Japanese officer, standing by a truck, actually waved at them, a casual flick of the hand to acknowledge a passing patrol. Tachovsky, maintaining the ruse, gave a lazy wave back. It was a moment of pure, terrifying absurdity. Enemies exchanging pleasantries in the middle of a kill zone. For 45 minutes, they rode through the belly of the beast. They saw the enemy's strength, their positions, and their desperation. They saw the civilians huddled in caves, the wounded being carried on stretchers. They saw the reality of the defense that no aerial photo could ever capture. When they finally turned their bikes around and headed back toward American lines, the adrenaline began to crash. The ride out was even more tense than the ride in. They were pushing their luck, and every second increased the chance that someone would look too closely, that a gust of wind would blow a cap off and reveal American features. They crossed back into the no man's land, separating the armies, ditching the bicycles in a ditch before approaching the Marine sentries. They were covered in sweat, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Tachovsky walked straight to Colonel Riseley's command post. He didn't need to salute. His uniform was stiff with grime and sweat. He simply pulled out a map and began to draw. "Don't send the tanks down 3rd Avenue," he said, marking a red X. "They have a 47mm gun waiting in the rubble. And don't assault the school from the front. The courtyard is a pre-sighted mortar zone. Go through the east wall." The intelligence was gold. When the 6th Marines launched their assault the next morning, they didn't walk into an ambush. They maneuvered around the strong points. They dropped artillery exactly where the Japanese were massing. They dismantled the defense of Saipan with a precision that stunned the enemy commanders. The bicycle patrol hadn't fired a single shot, yet it had done more damage to the Japanese defense than 1,000 rounds of howitzer fire. It proved that in the chaos of war, the most powerful weapon wasn't a rifle or a tank, it was the audacity to do exactly what the enemy thought was impossible. But the war didn't end in Saipan. And, as the campaign dragged on, the legend of the 40 Thieves began to attract attention from higher up. The brass realized that Tachovsky hadn't just built a good platoon, he had stumbled upon a new doctrine of warfare. But with recognition came a new problem: the attempt to categorize a unit that defied categorization. They weren't infantry. They weren't just snipers. And despite what later myths would claim, they weren't Navy SEALs. They were something the military didn't have a name for yet, and their legacy was about to get complicated. That complication has mutated over the decades into a persistent algorithm-friendly myth that Frank Tachovsky's 40 Thieves were the original Navy SEALs. It is a dramatic headline, perfect for a YouTube thumbnail, but it is historically illiterate. And frankly, the truth of what these men established is far more significant than a stolen lineage. The Navy SEALs trace their bloodline back to the NCDUs, Naval Combat Demolition Units, and UDT's underwater demolition teams, the frogmen of World War II who cleared invasion beaches with swim trunks and naval satchel charges. They were creatures of the surf. Tachovsky's men were creatures of the dirt. To call the 40 Thieves SEALs is to misunderstand the fundamental difference between direct action and deep reconnaissance. What Tachovsky and Colonel Riseley forged in the fires of Saipan was the genetic code for Marine Force reconnaissance and the modern Scout Sniper platoons. The distinction lies in the mission profile. A commando unit like the British SAS or the future SEALs often exists to break things, to blow up a radar station, sink a ship, or snatch a prisoner. Their success is measured in destruction, but the doctrine Tachovsky pioneered measured success in silence. His men were the first to master the discipline of the non-engagement. In the jungle, the hardest thing for a soldier to do is not shoot. When a scout sniper lies in a hide site, watching a high-ranking Japanese officer walk past at 50 yards, every instinct screams to pull the trigger. The thug impulse, the brawling instinct that got them thrown in the brig, wanted the fight, but Tachovsky had rewired their brains. He taught them that a dead officer is a momentary inconvenience to the enemy, but the map of an entire artillery regiment's position is a death sentence for the enemy army. They learned to be ghosts. They learned that their primary weapon wasn't the Springfield rifle or the stolen Thompson submachine gun. It was the radio. They were the eyes of the artillery, the force multiplier that allowed a single battery of 105mm howitzers to do the work of 1,000 infantrymen. This shift from warrior to human sensor is the cornerstone of modern special operations intelligence gathering. But this level of detachment came with a psychological cost that no manual could prepare them for. When the war ended in 1945, the 40 Thieves didn't get a parade. The Marine Corps, in its infinite wisdom, dissolved the unit. The experiment was over. The men who had lived like animals for months, who had slit throats in the dark and ridden bicycles through kill zones, were expected to simply turn off the killer instinct and go back to being grocery clerks and mechanics. Frank Tachovsky returned to Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't go on a lecture tour to brag about how he created the SEALs or how he defied the colonel. He took off the uniform, put on a suit, and eventually became the mayor of his small town. For decades, the people of Sturgeon Bay knew him only as Ski, the chain-smoking, no-nonsense public servant who fixed the potholes and managed the city budget. They had no idea that the man presiding over the town council meetings had once commanded a platoon of criminals in the most savage theater of the Second World War. This silence is the hallmark of the generation, but it was particularly acute for the Scout Snipers. There is a specific trauma attached to their work. The infantryman fires at a muzzle flash or a distant figure. The killing is impersonal and chaotic. The sniper watches his target through 8-power glass. He sees the enemy smoking a cigarette, writing a letter, or laughing with a friend. He sees the humanity before he extinguishes it. That intimacy with death leaves a stain that doesn't wash off with a victory medal. Tachovsky kept his demons locked in a footlocker in his attic. It wasn't until after he died in 2011 that his family opened the box and found the photos. The 40 thieves posing with their stolen jeeps, the grainy shots of the Saipan jungle, and the commendations that detailed acts of heroism bordering on madness. He had protected his family from the war just as he had protected the 6th Marines from the Japanese. He absorbed the horror so that others could live in peace. This was the final, unspoken lesson of the 40 thieves. They proved that elite didn't mean perfect marching or shiny boots. It meant the ability to endure the unendurable. They showed that the men's society was quickest to reject the rebels. The outcasts, the brig rats, often possessed the jagged edges necessary to cut through the fog of war. They weren't Navy SEALs. They were Marines. And for the men of the 6th Regiment who slept soundly on Saipan because Tachovsky's men were awake in the darkness, that was more than enough. The legacy of the 40 thieves is not a myth of superheroes. It is a reality of flesh and blood. They were 40 men who broke every rule to win the only prize that mattered, survival. Survival was the only metric that mattered. But for Frank Tachovsky, it wasn't just about keeping 40 men breathing. It was about keeping an entire regiment from walking into a massacre. By the time the island of Saipan was declared secure on the 9th of July 1944, the 40 thieves had paid the price for their audacity. They had suffered casualties, they were ravaged by dysentery, and they were physically hollowed out by the stress of living in the negative space between armies. But looking back at the operational maps, the vindication of Tachovsky's heretical experiment was undeniable. Every red X on the intelligence officer's map represented a pillbox that hadn't fired on a Marine platoon because the thieves had spotted it first. Every artillery barrage that landed on target was a testament to a voice on a radio, whispering coordinates from a hidden hole in the jungle. The 6th Marine Regiment had fought with its eyes open, while other units had stumbled in the dark. The lesson of the 40 thieves is a stark reminder of a truth the military often struggles to admit. Sometimes, the best soldiers aren't the ones who follow the manual, they are the ones who rewrite it. Colonel Riseley took a gamble on the men society had discarded. He bet that the aggression of the brig rat, the cunning of the thief, and the defiance of the brawler could be weaponized. He was right. The very traits that made these men unfit for peace made them masters of war. History has a way of sanitizing these stories, polishing the rough edges until the men look like statues. But we should remember them as they were. Look at that photograph of the bicycle patrol one last time. It isn't a picture of heroes posing for a monument. It's a picture of exhausted, dirty, desperate men who found a way to solve an impossible problem with the tools at hand. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for a standard operating procedure. They just got on the bikes and rode into the fire. If you believe that history should honor the men in the mud rather than the myths in the movies, make sure you're subscribed. We are building a library of the forgotten, the unorthodox, and the incredible, and we need you on the line with us. Hit that like button to help the algorithm find more people who respect the truth. Tachovsky's men had mastered the land, proving that stealth could defeat armor. But at the exact same time, just a few miles offshore, another group of men were inventing a suicidal way to clear the beaches using nothing but swim trunks, a face mask, and a satchel of high explosives. The 40 thieves didn't create the Navy SEALs, but these men did. We will cover the terrifying, underwater origin of the frogmen in our next operation.